Koda refused to leave the frozen hillside, even after the fire reached the trees, and Ethan realized the dog was protecting something no one else could see. A burning timber crashed behind him as Koda slammed into his legs, knocking him face first into the snow. The smell of smoke mixed with frozen pine, while a deep metallic thud echoed somewhere beneath the mountain. Ethan looked toward the ridge, and the dog stood staring at the same patch of ground as if waiting for him to understand. But what was buried there? And who else already knew? What do you think Koda was trying to protect? The cold always woke Ethan Brooks before the sun did. It wasn't the kind of cold that slipped quietly through a blanket. It arrived like an old memory, sharp and unwelcome. Even inside the faded blue pickup truck, parked beneath a stand of ponderosa pines in Montana's Bitterroot Mountains, the air carried the bite of another long winter morning. His eyes opened at exactly 4:17. No alarm, no clock, just the habit that Afghanistan had carved into him years ago. For a few seconds, he stayed perfectly still, listening. The wind brushed through the trees. Somewhere far off, a creek rolled beneath thin ice. Nothing moved close enough to matter. Only then did he breathe. Beside him, Koda lifted his head from the old army blanket stretched across the passenger seat. The 7-year-old German shepherd watched Ethan without making a sound. Years of military work had taught the dog not to bark unless there was a reason. "You heard it too?" Ethan whispered. Koda blinked once. The truck's metal frame suddenly gave a soft pop as the freezing temperature tightened the steel. The tiny sound exploded inside Ethan's head. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. His right hand shot toward the empty space beside the driver's seat, where a rifle had once rested. His shoulders tightened. His breathing shortened. Every muscle prepared for contact. Then reality returned. No convoy, no roadside bomb, no burning desert road. Only an old pickup settling in the cold. Ethan slowly lowered his hand. "Easy," he muttered to himself, rubbing both palms together until the shaking stopped. Koda climbed across the seat and rested his muzzle against Ethan's forearm. The pressure lasted only a moment. It was enough. The dog had learned years ago that sometimes the fastest way to bring Ethan back wasn't through commands. It was through silence. Outside, dawn slowly painted the mountains in pale blue. Ethan stepped from the truck, boots crunching across frozen gravel. His beard had grown longer over the past months, streaked with more gray than he remembered. At 44, his back still carried the posture of a soldier, but life had worn away the certainty that once came with it. The truck held nearly everything he owned. A toolbox, camping gear, 2 duffel bags, an old coffee pot blackened from campfires, Koda's worn canvas bed. That was home now. It hadn't always been. After returning from Afghanistan as a combat engineer, Ethan had tried to build a normal life. He repaired heavy equipment, married his high school sweetheart, bought a modest house outside Missoula. Then the nightmares came home before he did. Sleep disappeared. Jobs disappeared. The marriage followed. By the time he finally admitted he needed help, almost everything else had already slipped away. Only Koda remained. The retired military working dog had entered Ethan's life after both of them left service. Neither spoke much anymore. Neither needed to. While heating water over a small camp stove, Ethan's phone vibrated. Unknown number. He almost ignored it. Almost. "Mr. Brooks?" A woman's calm voice asked after the second ring. "This is Ethan. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm an attorney in Hamilton. I've been trying to locate you for several weeks." He frowned. "I don't owe anybody money." A quiet laugh answered. "No, sir. Quite the opposite." Silence settled between them. "Your uncle, Walter Brooks, passed away last month. The name landed awkwardly. Walter. He hadn't seen the man in nearly 20 years, a quiet mechanic who preferred mountains over cities and rarely spoke at family gatherings. I didn't know. I'm sorry. Ethan stared across the valley. Neither had been close enough to call each other. Grief didn't always arrive with tears. Sometimes it arrived as an uncomfortable emptiness. He left you his property. My what? 40 acres outside Pine Hollow, along with an old storage building. Ethan almost smiled. I think you have the wrong guy. I assure you I don't. Claire paused while turning papers. The deed transferred yesterday. He rubbed the back of his neck. I don't have money for taxes. The property taxes have already been paid through this year. That surprised him. There is one more thing. He waited. I've received multiple calls from representatives of Granite Ridge Mining. I've never heard of them. They've been asking whether you're willing to sell immediately. Ethan frowned. Why? They haven't said. What are they offering? $30,000. He looked around the frozen campsite. $30,000 could buy another truck, a small apartment, a chance to begin again. For 40 acres in the middle of nowhere? That's exactly why I found it unusual. Claire's voice lowered. The county records describe the property as undeveloped land with no utilities, just an abandoned equipment shed. So why are they pushing? I don't know. She hesitated. But if I were you... Yeah? I'd look at it before signing anything. After the call ended, Ethan sat quietly for a long time. Koda rested beside him, watching a pair of ravens circle above the valley. The decision should have been easy. Sell. Take the money. Drive south. Start over. Instead, something refused to settle inside him. Military training had left him with one instinct that never faded. When people hurried you toward a decision, they usually knew something you didn't. By late afternoon, Ethan's pickup climbed a narrow mountain road that twisted through dense pine forest. Snow lined both shoulders. The farther they drove, the weaker the cell signal became. Finally, the trees opened. 40 acres stretched before him, silent, untouched. A weathered wooden equipment shed stood alone against the mountain backdrop, its roof sagging beneath years of snow. No fences, no power lines, no smoke. Nothing. This is it, Ethan whispered. He parked. The engine ticked as it cooled. For the first time all day. Koda didn't jump out. The German shepherd climbed slowly from the truck, then stopped. His ears rose. His body froze. His amber eyes locked onto a distant pine-covered hillside nearly 300 yards away, not moving, not blinking, not making a sound. Ethan followed the dog's stare. There was nothing there, only trees, and a silence that suddenly felt much heavier than before. Ethan kept his eyes on the hillside while Koda remained frozen beside the truck. The dog's posture wasn't curiosity. Ethan had seen that stance before, years ago in eastern Afghanistan, when Koda would lock onto a scent long before any soldier noticed movement. His ears were forward. His breathing slowed. Every instinct was focused on one unseen point. What is it, buddy? Koda didn't look back. Ethan scanned the slope the way he'd been trained to clear an observation sector. Left to right. High ground first. Tree line. Shadows beneath the pines. Fallen logs large enough to hide a man. Nothing. No movement. No sound except the wind drifting through the evergreens. He slung his worn duffel over one shoulder and walked toward the old shed. Every few steps he glanced back. Koda followed now, but reluctantly, looking over his shoulder as though leaving something unfinished. The building was older than he'd expected. Gray boards weathered by decades of Montana winters. Rust streaked from the hinges. One window had been covered with plywood from the inside. The heavy padlock hung open. Claire must have arranged for the county to leave it unlocked. Ethan pushed the door. It groaned slowly, revealing a single dusty room. Old shelves, a rusted wood stove, broken tools, coils of wire, a workbench coated in years' of fine gray dust. No electricity, no running water. Nothing worth $30,000. He walked the perimeter automatically. Corners first. Roof supports. Possible exits. The habit had never left him. Only after convincing himself the structure was empty did he allow his shoulders to relax. Koda wandered inside, sniffing the floor with unusual intensity. Instead of exploring every corner, the dog circled once, then returned to the doorway. Watching. Waiting. As if the shed itself wasn't what interested him. A truck engine echoed somewhere below the ridge. Ethan turned immediately. One vehicle. Large diesel. Moving slowly. He stepped outside before it reached the clearing. A white pickup climbed the final stretch of road, company logo painted neatly across both doors. Granite Ridge Mining. The truck stopped 20 feet away. A man in his early 50s climbed out wearing polished work boots that had clearly never spent much time in mud. He smiled before speaking. "Mr. Brooks?" Ethan nodded once. "Name's Randall Pierce." He extended his hand. Ethan looked at it for a second before shaking. The grip lasted exactly as long as necessary. "No offense," Randall said pleasantly. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come. I just got here." "I can see that." His eyes drifted past Ethan. Not toward the shed. Toward the distant hillside where Koda had first stopped. Only for a heartbeat. But Ethan noticed. Combat engineers survived by noticing small things. "You've got quite a piece of property," Randall continued. "So I'm told. We'd like to make your life easier." He reached into the truck and produced a leather folder. "Our company is prepared to purchase everything today." He laid several papers across the hood. $30,000. Cash equivalent upon closing. County fees covered. Legal costs covered. Closing within 48 hours. Fast. Too fast. "You drove all the way out here without knowing whether I'd even show up?" Ethan asked. Randall smiled again. "We've been hopeful." "You've never seen me?" "No." "But you already printed the contract." Randall hesitated. "We like to be prepared." Ethan looked at the paperwork without touching it. "What's under my land?" The smile faded only slightly. "Nothing." "Then why do you want it?" "Our company has future development plans." "For this?" He gestured toward the empty mountains. No road. No power. No utilities. Randall folded his hands calmly. "We think long-term." Ethan remained silent. Silence made people uncomfortable. It always had. Finally, Randall spoke again. "If 30 isn't enough, we might have room to adjust." There it was. Negotiation before the first refusal. Not normal. Koda suddenly stepped between Ethan and the visitor. No barking. No growling. Only a low vibration deep in his chest. Barely audible. "Enough." Randall instinctively took one step backward. "Friendly dog?" he asked. "He usually is." The answer hung in the cold air. "Usually." Randall forced another smile. "I don't suppose you'll sign today?" "No." Tomorrow? I haven't even walked my own land. You really should think carefully. I am. Randall gathered the papers, slower now. Our offer won't stay forever. Ethan watched him climb back into the truck. Before closing the door, Randall looked once more toward the same hillside. Exactly the same place. Then he drove away. The diesel engine faded into the trees. Neither Ethan nor Koda moved until the sound disappeared completely. "Did you catch that?" Ethan asked quietly. Koda looked up. He never once looked at the shed. The dog tilted his head. He only cared about the hill. As the afternoon faded into evening, Ethan unpacked what little he owned. He swept a corner of the shed clean enough to unroll his sleeping bag, collected fallen branches, lit the old wood stove after checking the chimney for nests. Simple tasks, familiar tasks, the kind that kept the mind from wandering. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily through the fading light. Darkness settled quickly in the mountains. Ethan ate canned stew warmed over the stove while Koda finished his meal beside the doorway. Neither made much noise. Night carried differently in places like this. Every sound traveled. Every silence seemed intentional. Long after the fire burned low, Ethan finally lay down. Sleep came in fragments. A sudden crack outside jerked him awake. His heart pounded. For one terrifying second, he smelled burning diesel instead of pine smoke. He reached for a rifle that wasn't there. The shed returned. The fire. Koda. Montana. Not Helmand Province. He exhaled slowly. Koda was gone. The blanket beside the stove was empty. Ethan stood instantly. The door hung slightly open. Fresh snow had begun covering the ground. Outside, faint paw prints disappeared toward the same distant hillside. Nearly 20 minutes later, Koda returned alone. His breathing remained calm. No sign of panic, but his front paws were stained with damp, reddish soil that didn't match the pale mountain earth surrounding the shed. The dog looked directly into Ethan's eyes, then silently turned back toward the darkness beyond the trees. For a moment, neither of them moved. Snow drifted between the pines, soft enough to hide sound, but not tracks. Ethan crouched beside Koda and touched the reddish dirt clinging to the dog's front paws. It wasn't the pale, rocky soil surrounding the shed. This earth was darker, almost rust-colored, damp beneath the thin layer of snow. He rubbed it between his fingers. Clay. Different from anything he'd seen since arriving. "Where'd you find this?" he asked quietly. Koda turned toward the ridge again. Then he waited. Not pulling, not barking. Waiting. That alone told Ethan this wasn't random. Military working dogs didn't repeat behavior without purpose. "Not tonight," Ethan said after studying the dark tree line. He had spent enough years in hostile terrain to know when curiosity became carelessness. Night belonged to the mountain now. If someone else had been watching this property, stumbling through unfamiliar woods in darkness would only make him an easy target. He closed the shed door, dropped the wooden crossbar into place, and slept in short stretches with one boot still on. Morning arrived beneath a gray sky. The mountains were silent except for ravens gliding above the valley. Ethan boiled coffee on the old stove while Koda sat near the doorway, staring toward the same hill as if daylight had changed nothing. "All right," Ethan said, pulling on his work gloves. "You lead." Koda stepped outside immediately. His pace wasn't hurried. He moved with quiet confidence, stopping every few yards to make sure Ethan followed. The route climbed through dense lodgepole pines where fallen needles muffled every footstep. Ethan noticed old game trails crossing the slope, fresh deer tracks, and a creek running beneath sheets of ice. Without thinking, he marked landmarks the way he always had overseas. Large split boulder, dead cedar, narrow drainage. Possible observation point. old habits. They kept people alive. Halfway up the hill, Koda stopped. He sniffed a cluster of rocks, then continued another 50 yards, before freezing beside a patch of ground hidden beneath tangled brush. The soil here was different. Dark red, loose, recently disturbed. Ethan knelt. He brushed away leaves with both hands. Nothing obvious. No footprints. No tire marks. Yet the earth settled differently beneath his weight, almost hollow. Koda began digging, not wildly, methodically, 3 quick strokes. Then he stopped and looked back, exactly as he had done the night before. Ethan unfolded the compact entrenching shovel from his truck pack. The steel handle felt strangely familiar in his hands. He had dug too many holes with tools like this: protective walls, IED investigations, emergency fighting positions. Every scrape of metal against frozen dirt carried echoes he wished would stay buried. The first few inches revealed only roots, then packed clay. The digging became harder. Sweat gathered beneath his jacket despite the cold. Koda never wandered away. He watched every movement, occasionally sniffing the edge of the hole before sitting again. Nearly 40 minutes passed. Ethan leaned on the shovel to catch his breath. His pulse had just begun to settle when a distant helicopter echoed somewhere beyond the mountains. The sound froze him, not because of the aircraft itself, because for one terrible heartbeat, it wasn't Montana anymore. Heat, dust, rotor wash, someone shouting, "Clear the LZ!" Then, a blast. His chest tightened. His hands instinctively covered the back of his neck before his mind caught up with reality. The helicopter faded into the distance. Only birds remained. Koda immediately walked over and pressed his shoulder firmly against Ethan's leg, grounding him, anchoring him. Ethan closed his eyes, counted one slow breath, then another. "I'm here," he whispered. "Not there." When he finally looked down again, Koda had returned to the shallow hole, waiting. Ethan drove the shovel back into the earth. One more strike, then another. The third hit produced a sound completely unlike stone. Clang! The vibration traveled straight through the handle into his arms. Metal. He knelt immediately, carefully scraping away dirt with his gloved hands. A smooth gray surface slowly appeared beneath the clay. Flat. Cold. Perfectly manufactured. Not natural. Not abandoned junk. Steel. He widened the opening. The plate stretched farther than he expected. Its edges disappeared beneath the surrounding soil. This wasn't scrap metal someone had discarded years ago. It had been installed, deliberately. Koda stood over the exposed corner without moving. His ears suddenly lifted. He wasn't looking at the plate anymore. He was looking downhill. Ethan followed his gaze. The trees below stood perfectly still. Too still. His instincts sharpened. Someone else, Tamam, might already know exactly where this place was. Ethan stayed perfectly still. His eyes swept the slope below in slow, deliberate arcs. Years of searching for disturbed earth along Afghan roads had trained him to notice what didn't belong. A straight line where nature preferred curves. A shadow that held too long. A flash of glass where there should only be bark. Nothing. Only rows of pine trees rocking gently in the winter wind. Koda remained motionless. The dog's gaze never left the lower hillside. Ethan crouched again beside the exposed steel plate. He brushed away more dirt with his gloves instead of using the shovel. Metal rang louder than earth, and unnecessary noise had a way of inviting company. The plate extended farther than he'd first imagined. Nearly 6 feet across. Its surface was weathered but surprisingly free of corrosion. Whoever had buried it hadn't simply covered it with dirt. They had engineered it to stay hidden. His fingers found the edge, half an inch thick. Industrial steel, not something a rancher hauled into the woods for convenience. He worked around the perimeter until his hand stopped against something circular buried beneath compacted clay. A bolt, large, hexagonal. Another followed 3 feet away. Then another. The plate had been anchored from below. Ethan leaned back. This wasn't dropped here. Koda glanced toward him briefly before returning his attention downhill. It was installed. The realization settled heavily between them. He looked across the 40 acres stretching toward distant ridgelines. No visible roads. No abandoned mine entrances. No utility lines. Yet someone had invested enormous effort to bury this beneath an isolated hillside. Why? The question stayed with him all afternoon. By sunset, he had uncovered almost half the plate, but found no handle, no hinges, no obvious way to lift it. He finally covered the exposed section with pine branches before hiking back toward the shed. Old instincts again. Never leave your objective exposed overnight. As they approached the clearing, Ethan stopped. Something looked wrong. Not dramatic. Small. Almost forgettable. The shed door stood exactly where he'd left it. The truck remained untouched. But his boot prints from that morning were no longer alone. He crouched immediately. Fresh tracks crossed the frozen ground. Heavy work boots. One person, maybe two. The impressions were crisp enough that the snow hadn't begun softening their edges. Recent. Very recent. He followed them carefully. The stranger had walked around the truck once, stopped beside the rear tire, then circled the shed. Not once had the prints approached the woodpile or the creek. Whoever came here hadn't been exploring. They had been checking, watching. The trail disappeared into the trees without returning toward the access road. Ethan's jaw tightened. Professional. The visitor understood how to avoid leaving an obvious trail. Koda lowered his nose and silently followed the scent into the forest. Only 30 yards. Then he stopped beside a patch of flattened grass. Ethan searched the area carefully. Nothing. No cigarette butts. No food wrappers. No broken branches. Clean. Too clean. Whoever had stood here knew enough not to leave anything behind. That bothered Ethan more than if they had. Inside the shed, fading daylight spilled across the old workbench. He began searching every shelf. If his uncle had hidden something beneath that hill, perhaps he had left instructions somewhere nearby. Most drawers held rusted bolts, cracked wrenches, faded receipts from decades ago. Until he found an old wooden toolbox beneath the bench. Inside lay a leather notebook. The cover had darkened with age. Walter Brooks. Stamped neatly into one corner. Ethan opened it. Most pages contained ordinary maintenance notes. Generator repairs. Weather records. Seed orders. Then entire sections had been torn out. Cleanly. Page after page missing. Someone hadn't stolen the notebook. They had removed specific information. Near the back remained a folded topographic map of the property. Red pencil circles marked several locations. One circle surrounded the hillside where Koda kept returning. Another farther north had been crossed out completely. Across the bottom margin, Walter had written only 6 words. Never trust anyone who comes early. Ethan read the sentence twice, then 3 times. Outside. A faint crunch echoed beyond the shed. Not an animal. Too heavy. Koda was already moving. The German shepherd slipped silently to the doorway, every muscle tightening beneath his thick coat. His ears stood rigid. His breathing slowed. He didn't bark. He never barked unless there was no other choice. Ethan quietly extinguished the lantern. Darkness filled the shed. He stepped beside the window and looked through a narrow crack in the plywood. The clearing appeared empty. Snow drifted peacefully through the fading light. Then, far beyond the truck, something caught the last glow of sunset. For less than a second, a brief flash. Glass. Like sunlight reflecting from a pair of binoculars. And just as quickly, it vanished. Ethan didn't move. The instinct to chase was still somewhere inside him, but years of combat had taught him something more valuable than courage. Observation came before action. He waited another full minute at the narrow crack in the plywood. Nothing. No second flash. No silhouette. No sound except the steady whisper of wind pushing through the pines. Beside him, Koda stood like a carved statue, nose lifted slightly toward the trees. "Contact may still be watching," Ethan whispered. The words came naturally, old battlefield language returning without thought. He stepped away from the window and immediately darkened the rest of the shed. The lantern remained off. The small fire inside the stove was dampened until only faint red embers glowed beneath the iron grate. No light, no silhouette, nothing to draw attention. He slipped into the habit of preparing an overnight defensive position. His truck was backed against the shed, so one side remained protected. A length of fishing line from his survival kit became a simple trip indicator stretched between two low shrubs. Empty tin cans hung from it, barely touching one another. Primitive, quiet, effective. He scattered fresh snow over his own boot prints leading to the shed entrance. Then he climbed a narrow ladder into the hayloft above the workbench. From there he could observe both the doorway and one side of the clearing without exposing himself. Koda settled beside him. Neither of them slept. Hours drifted by. The moon climbed above the mountain ridge, bathing the clearing in pale silver. Near midnight, Koda's ears twitched. 1 second later, Ethan heard it. Crunch, snow, very soft. Someone walking slowly. He raised a pair of compact binoculars from his pack. Two figures emerged between the trees nearly 80 yards away. Dark clothing, winter camouflage jackets, faces covered. Neither carried flashlights. That alone told Ethan these weren't curious hikers. The taller man paused and slowly swept the clearing with something held at eye level. Night vision. The second pointed toward the hillside where Ethan had uncovered the steel plate. They weren't interested in the shed, exactly as Randall Pierce hadn't been. The two men disappeared into the darkness beyond the ridge. Ethan counted silently. 100, 200, 300. He waited. Never rushed toward uncertainty. 20 minutes later, the pair returned. This time they stopped halfway down the hill. One knelt. The other unfolded a small tablet glowing faintly green beneath a covered screen. GPS mapping. They were searching for something very precise. Koda looked at Ethan. The old military dog didn't wait for commands anymore. He simply understood. Ethan nodded once. The German shepherd slipped from the loft without making a sound. His paws barely disturbed the dusty floor. The rear wall of the shed had a broken section hidden behind stacked lumber. Koda disappeared through it into the night. Ethan remained above, watching, waiting. The two strangers continued comparing their GPS with the hillside. One finally shook his head. "No, not here." The words carried faintly through the cold air. "Try 10 meters east." They moved again. Closer. Within 50 yards now. Still completely unaware that another set of eyes watched every step. Then, far beyond them, a single low growl floated through the trees. Barely audible. Not threatening, intentional. Both men turned instantly. There! One jogged toward the sound, the other followed. Exactly as Koda intended. Ethan almost smiled. The dog wasn't attacking. He was redirecting, buying time, leading them away from the true location. The forest swallowed all three shapes. Silence returned. 5 minutes later, Koda emerged from a different direction entirely, circling back toward the shed without ever crossing the stranger's path again. Even after retirement, the old canine still remembered deception drills. Nearly 40 minutes passed before the two men finally returned to the clearing, frustrated, empty-handed. "We're wasting time," one muttered. "The coordinates are wrong." "No." The taller man looked back toward the hill. "Somebody's already been digging." Ethan's heartbeat slowed. So, they knew. One man pulled something from his jacket. Small, black, no larger than a matchbox. He crouched beside a weathered fence post near the access road. His gloved hand pressed the object underneath the lowest rail. Then both men disappeared into the trees. Their footsteps faded. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Ethan still waited. Only after another half hour did he finally climb down. Outside, the clearing felt colder than before. Koda trotted directly toward the fence post. He sniffed once, twice, then pawed gently beneath the weathered timber. Ethan knelt. Hidden against the underside of the rail sat a compact magnetic device with a blinking green light. He carefully removed it without pressing any buttons. Years spent locating roadside explosives had taught him to respect unfamiliar electronics. He examined it beneath his red filter flashlight. Commercial GPS tracker. Battery-powered. Recently activated. Someone planned to return. Not just once. Again. And again. Ethan looked toward the silent hillside where the buried steel plate waited beneath frozen earth. The mountain was no longer keeping only his uncle's secret. Now, it knew someone else's. Ethan turned the GPS tracker over in his gloved hand one last time before removing its batteries. The blinking green light disappeared. "You're done talking," he murmured. He slipped the device into an empty ammunition pouch inside his pack. It might become evidence later. Right now, it was simply confirmation that the men hadn't been guessing. They knew something had been hidden on this mountain. The first light of dawn spread across the Bitterroot Range in pale bands of silver. Frost clung to every pine needle, turning the forest into a field of tiny mirrors. Koda was already awake, sitting outside the shed, with his eyes fixed on the hillside. He wasn't restless anymore. He seemed patient, as though the next step had always been part of the plan. Ethan finished a cup of black coffee, shouldered his shovel, pry bar, socket set, and recovery straps, then nodded toward the ridge. "Let's finish what we started." The climb felt shorter this time, perhaps because he no longer wondered whether the hill mattered. He knew it did. Snow still covered most of yesterday's excavation, but Koda walked directly to the exact spot without hesitation. He brushed the loose powder aside with 2 careful strokes of his paw before sitting beside the exposed edge of the steel plate. Ethan smiled faintly. "You've got a better memory than I do." For the next 3 hours he worked steadily. Not quickly, carefully. Combat engineers learned early that forcing hidden structures usually damaged the very thing you hoped to preserve. He cleared every bolt until the entire perimeter became visible. 8 industrial anchor bolts, each identical, each untouched by rust. Someone had coated them with protective grease before sealing them underground. That detail bothered him. Whoever built this expected it to survive decades. He fitted a socket over the nearest bolt. It didn't move. He leaned harder. Still nothing. Koda suddenly stood and walked toward the center of the steel plate. He sniffed once, twice, then scratched lightly beside what looked like an ordinary drainage groove. Ethan knelt beside him. The groove wasn't a drainage channel. It was perfectly straight. Machined. His fingers followed it until they reached a shallow, circular depression, almost invisible beneath layers of packed dirt. Inside sat another bolt. Different. Larger. Painted the same dull gray as the steel itself. Almost impossible to notice. Good catch. He changed sockets. 3/4 inch. The wrench settled firmly onto the hidden bolt. He turned. Nothing. He shifted his weight. The bolt groaned. 1/4 turn. Then another. A deep metallic click echoed somewhere beneath the mountain. Both Ethan and Koda froze. The sound wasn't directly below them. It traveled farther underground, like heavy machinery waking after a very long sleep. Then, a low hydraulic hiss rolled upward through the earth. The steel plate trembled. Not violently. Smoothly. The entire center section began lowering into the ground by itself. Dust drifted from the edges as hidden mechanisms, protected for decades beneath frozen soil, continued working with astonishing precision. Ethan stepped back instinctively. The opening widened until a narrow staircase appeared beneath the descending platform. Cold air drifted upward. Not stale. Dry. Filtered. Impossible. He stared into the darkness. No one builds something like this, unless they expect it to be found one day. Koda moved first. He stopped at the top step, looked back once, waiting for permission. Ethan switched on his flashlight. Stay close. The steel stairs descended nearly 20 feet before ending at a reinforced concrete corridor. The walls were smooth, poured in place. Electrical conduit disappeared into the ceiling. Emergency lights lined one side. Dead now, but carefully installed. The air smelled faintly of machine oil, dry concrete, and old paper. Not decay. Preservation. At the far end stood a heavy steel door with an old mechanical wheel handle. No electronic lock, no keypad, just engineering. Ethan examined the hinges. No pry marks, no damage. Whoever sealed it had expected only one person to open it. He gripped the wheel. It resisted briefly before turning. One locking lug, then another. The door slowly swung inward. His flashlight swept across the room. Shelving, work tables, metal filing cabinets, rows of waterproof storage containers, maps rolled into tubes, glass jars holding carefully labeled soil samples, rack after rack of sealed water bottles tagged with dates stretching back years, an entire wall covered with aerial photographs of mountains, rivers, and excavation sites connected by handwritten strings. This wasn't a bunker built for hiding. It was a workspace, a laboratory, a record. In the center of the room sat a wooden desk. Unlike everything else, it had been polished recently enough to retain a soft shine. On top rested a single envelope, cream-colored, his name written neatly across the front. Ethan Brooks. The handwriting was steady, patient, as if the writer had believed without question that someday someone named Ethan Brooks would walk through that door. Koda padded quietly across the room. Instead of sniffing everywhere as dogs usually do in unfamiliar places, he walked directly to the desk. Then he lay down beside it. His tail thumped the floor once, softly, like a soldier reporting, mission complete. Ethan reached for the envelope with hands steadier than he expected. The paper crackled softly beneath his fingers. For the first time since arriving on the mountain, he realized this place had never been waiting for a mining company. It had been waiting for him. Ethan stood in the silence for several long moments before opening the envelope. The paper had yellowed with age, but the seal remained intact. Inside was a handwritten letter. The ink was slightly faded, yet every line was firm and deliberate. Ethan. If you are reading this, then Koda did exactly what I hoped he would. His eyes stopped on the second line. Koda. Not the dog. Not your dog. His name. Ethan slowly lowered the letter and looked across the room. Koda remained lying beside the desk, watching him with quiet, patient eyes. You've been here before. The German shepherd's ears twitched. Not in denial, not in surprise, simply acknowledging words that needed no answer. Ethan continued reading. You probably believe these 40 acres are all I had left. The truth is, I never cared about the land. I cared about what was happening beneath it. The next pages explained why. Walter Brooks had spent nearly 30 years as an environmental engineer working under federal contracts across the northern Rockies. Most assignments involved groundwater surveys, abandoned mines, and contamination studies. Then, 12 years earlier, one survey had uncovered something impossible to ignore. Industrial solvents, heavy metals, chemical residues that did not belong beneath untouched mountain forests. At first, Walter believed an old mining operation had been responsible. The evidence proved otherwise. Every contaminated sample pointed toward illegal dumping that had continued for years. The companies responsible purchased remote land through shell corporations. Waste was buried deep beneath forgotten valleys. Records disappeared. Ownership changed. The land looked untouched again. Except underground. Walter had refused to sign the final environmental clearance. 3 weeks later, his contract was terminated. No explanation, no appeal. He kept digging on his own. The letter directed Ethan toward a wall of steel filing cabinets. Drawer B4. He crossed the room. The cabinet slid open smoothly despite its age. Inside rested hundreds of carefully labeled folders. Water samples, soil analyses, groundwater flow maps, laboratory reports, every document cross-referenced with dates stretching back more than a decade. Ethan unfolded one geological map across the work table. Colored arrows traced underground aquifers beneath the Bitterroot Range. Blue lines flowed south, toward ranches, toward small towns, toward people. A red circle marked the 40-acre property. Another 10 red circles stretched across neighboring valleys, connected, not isolated. His military training had taught him how to read terrain. Now he followed underground terrain instead. The contamination wasn't staying beneath one mountain. Water carried it, slowly, quietly, relentlessly. He reached another page. Projected migration. Estimated population at risk. 38,000. Ethan leaned back. His uncle hadn't hidden treasure. He had hidden proof, enough proof to destroy a corporation, or save thousands of people. Koda suddenly stood, his head turned sharply toward the entrance corridor. Not alarmed, alert. Someone was approaching. Ethan killed his flashlight immediately. Darkness swallowed the room except for the faint daylight filtering down the open stairwell above. Footsteps. Not inside the bunker. Outside. Above them. Crunching softly across snow. One person. Maybe two. They stopped directly over the hidden entrance. Both Ethan and Koda remained motionless. The silence stretched. Then, a vehicle door slammed somewhere beyond the trees. An engine started. Faded away. Only after another 5 minutes did Ethan climb halfway up the steel staircase. The entrance remained closed exactly as before. No one had opened it. Someone had simply checked. He descended again. They're getting closer. Back at the desk, he found another sealed envelope beneath the first. This one addressed to Claire Bennett, the same attorney who had called him. He frowned. Walter had expected her involvement. Before he could open it, An old satellite phone resting beside the desk suddenly vibrated. Once. Twice. Its battery indicator still showed one green bar. Impossible after so many years. A small handwritten note beneath it read, "Charge maintained by solar backup. Use only if necessary." The phone vibrated again. Unknown number. Ethan hesitated, then answered. "This is Ethan Brooks." Several seconds passed. Then a woman's familiar voice spoke. "Ethan, it's Claire." She sounded different, out of breath, as though she had been driving for hours. "I've been trying your cell all morning. No signal up here, I figured." She paused. "When you inherited the property, did you find anything unusual?" Ethan looked around the hidden room. Rows of evidence, maps, samples, his uncle's life's work. "I think I found more than unusual." Claire became very quiet. "My father worked with your uncle. That caught him completely off guard. He never told me. He couldn't." Another pause. "My father tried to expose the same dumping operation 15 years ago. What happened? He lost everything." Her voice tightened. "His career, his reputation. And eventually, my father." Ethan slowly sat down. The story was becoming larger than one mountain, larger than Walter, larger than 40 acres. Claire spoke again. "If Walter left you what I think he did, they'll come for it." Ethan glanced toward Koda. The old German shepherd had already positioned himself facing the corridor, watching, waiting, ready. Outside, hidden somewhere among the pines, a motion-activated trail camera clicked once. Neither Ethan nor Claire heard it, but somewhere beyond the mountain, someone had just received a fresh image showing exactly who had entered Walter Brooks's land. Ethan ended the satellite call and stood quietly in the underground room. He looked once more at the rows of filing cabinets, the neatly labeled water samples, and the topographic maps spread across the work table. His uncle hadn't hidden this evidence because he was afraid. He had hidden it because he knew someday someone else would have to finish the job. Ethan carefully folded the geological maps back into their tubes. He photographed every important document with his phone before placing them exactly where he had found them. Years spent documenting explosive sites had taught him never to disturb a scene more than necessary. "Preserve the objective," he whispered. The old phrase still came naturally. Koda waited beside the stairs. One sharp glance was enough. Time to leave. Before sealing the chamber, Ethan memorized every step of the opening mechanism. 3/4-inch socket, hidden bolt, counterclockwise, hydraulic release. Then he closed the steel door. The heavy locking wheel turned with a satisfying series of solid clunks. The staircase slowly disappeared as the platform rose back into place. By the time fresh pine needles and loose snow covered the seam again, the hillside looked untouched, exactly as Walter had intended. Back at the shed, Ethan began preparing for visitors, not because he wanted a fight, because experience had taught him that once people realized you possessed something valuable, they rarely asked politely a second time. He moved his truck behind a cluster of large spruce trees instead of leaving it in the open. He carried several boxes of canned food and camping gear into the forest, creating a hidden cache nearly 100 yards away. He filled 2 water containers from the creek, checked every approach to the property, marked distances in his notebook. 300 yards to the northern tree line, 160 to the old logging road, limited cover on the western slope. Good observation from the eastern ridge. Simple, practical. The kind of work that quieted his mind until sunset. A sudden metallic bang echoed from the shed as an old shovel slipped against the workbench. The sound hit Ethan like a rifle shot. In an instant, he wasn't standing in Montana anymore. He was kneeling beside a dusty road outside Kandahar. The burned shell of an MRAP leaned awkwardly into a ditch. Someone screamed over the radio. Smoke. Diesel. Blood. Brooks! Move! His body reacted before thought. He dropped to one knee, eyes searching, hands reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. His breathing shortened, his pulse hammered. Then, warm fur pressed firmly against his shoulder. Koda. The German shepherd leaned his full weight against Ethan until the shaking slowly faded. Ethan rested one hand against the dog's neck. I'm back. His voice barely carried. I'm back. The mountains answered with silence. Night settled quickly over the Bitterroots. Clouds covered the moon, leaving only darkness beneath the pines. Inside the shed, Ethan kept every light extinguished. Only a tiny red lens illuminated the notebook where he reviewed Walter's maps. Just after midnight. Koda lifted his head, his ears locked forward. No growl, only complete attention. Ethan immediately killed the red light. Both remained perfectly still. Several seconds later, a faint orange glow flickered through the cracks in the wall. Not moonlight, moving light. Fire. He crawled silently to the side window. Two figures stood outside near the eastern wall. The same height, the same dark winter clothing. One carried a fuel can. The other struck something against his boot. A flare ignited. Without hesitation, the first man splashed gasoline along the weathered boards. The liquid spread beneath the dry timber like black water. Ethan's jaw tightened. They're burning it. The flare arced through the darkness. Glass shattered. Flames erupted instantly, climbing the old wood faster than seemed possible. The eastern wall became a sheet of orange. Smoke rolled beneath the roof. Koda looked toward the hidden hillside, then back at Ethan. He understood. The shed wasn't the mission. The evidence was. Leave it, Ethan whispered. We saved the objective. They slipped through the concealed opening at the rear of the building, just as another window burst inward from the heat. The two men remained near the road, watching, waiting to see if anyone ran out. Ethan stayed low behind fallen logs, moving exactly as he had moved through hostile valleys years before. Slow, controlled, never silhouetted against the flames. The fire roared behind them. Then, a section of the burning roof groaned. Ethan looked back instinctively. At that exact moment, one blazing support beam broke free. It crashed toward him. Before he could react, Koda slammed into his left side with every pound of strength he had. The impact threw Ethan clear. The beam exploded against the frozen ground where he had been standing. Sparks showered the snow. A sharp cry cut through the night. Not from Ethan, from Koda. The German shepherd stumbled. His front leg buckled. A jagged strip of burning sheet metal had sliced across his shoulder as he pushed Ethan away. Koda! Ethan dropped beside him immediately. The wound bled steadily beneath singed fur. Not life-threatening, but deep enough to matter. The strangers glanced toward the movement. One started forward. The other grabbed his arm. No. The fire's enough. They climbed into their vehicle. Moments later, red taillights disappeared down the mountain road. Only then did Ethan lift Koda carefully onto a bed of pine boughs behind the rocks. He opened the military trauma kit he still carried everywhere. Saline rinse, compression dressing, elastic wrap. His hands moved automatically. Years of treating battlefield injuries had left muscle memory stronger than thought. Koda never pulled away, never whimpered again. He simply watched Ethan while the bandage tightened around his shoulder. When it was finished, Ethan rested his forehead gently against the dog's. You saved me. the flames behind them reflected in Koda's dark eyes. For the first time since arriving on the mountain, Ethan realized he wasn't the only one still carrying old scars. Koda lay quietly on the bed of pine boughs while dawn slowly pushed away the darkness. The bandage around his shoulder had already begun to stain through, but the bleeding had slowed. Ethan checked the wound again, running practiced fingers around the edges without pressing too hard. No fever. No swelling yet. "You're going to be all right," Koda answered by nudging Ethan's wrist with his nose. It was the same gesture he'd used after patrols overseas whenever Ethan returned from clearing roads littered with the possibility of hidden explosives. Neither of them had ever needed many words. The fire had burned itself out by sunrise. Only the stone chimney remained standing. Thin ribbons of smoke drifted upward into the cold Montana sky. The shed that Walter Brooks had left behind was gone, exactly as someone had intended. Ethan walked carefully through the charred remains. The workbench had collapsed. The old wood stove had cracked from the heat. Most of the tools were twisted into useless shapes. Yet one thing bothered him. The attackers had poured fuel only along the eastern wall, not the entire building. They hadn't wanted to destroy everything. Only enough to convince people that everything had been destroyed. His eyes narrowed. They weren't looking for revenge. They were looking for certainty. He looked toward the hillside. Fortunately, they had burned the wrong place. By mid-morning, Claire Bennett arrived in a dusty gray SUV. She stepped out before the engine stopped completely. The moment she saw the burned ruins, she removed her sunglasses. "My God." "They came last night," Ethan said. She looked toward Koda lying beneath a spruce tree. "What happened to him?" "He saved my life." Claire knelt beside the German shepherd. Koda sniffed her hand once before resting his head again. "You've got a good soldier here." Ethan managed the faintest smile. "The best one." Together they walked to the hidden entrance. Claire stopped speaking entirely once she descended into Walter's underground chamber. She moved slowly between the filing cabinets, touching labels as though she already recognized them. So he really did it. He kept everything. Ethan watched her expression change as she opened folder after folder. Soil chemistry, groundwater migration, corporate purchase records. She stopped before one cabinet. The label read, "Personal Correspondence." Inside lay several sealed envelopes. Most were addressed to government agencies that no longer existed under the same names. One carried Claire's name. Another was addressed to Ethan. Different handwriting from the first letter. Older. Walter had written it years later. Ethan carefully broke the seal. The letter was shorter, much more personal. "Ethan, if you are reading this," then Koda finished his last assignment. His breathing stopped for a moment. He looked toward the doorway where the German shepherd waited quietly despite his injured shoulder. "There is something I never told you. After your final deployment, I requested a retired military working dog through a veterans transition program. I specifically asked for Koda. Not because he was highly trained, because he already trusted you." Ethan lowered the page. Memories surfaced. The adoption paperwork. The volunteer who had simply smiled and said, "He picked you first." Walter continued. "Before my health failed, I brought Koda here several times. I never trained him to guard this place. Dogs like him don't protect locations. They protect responsibilities." He watched me open the chamber. He watched me close it. I trusted that if I wasn't here someday, he would remember. Ethan slowly closed his eyes. Every strange moment since arriving suddenly made sense. Koda hadn't wandered randomly. He hadn't been chasing scents. He had been following memory, not treasure, not instinct, duty. Claire quietly wiped at one eye before pretending to continue reading another file. He loved that dog, she said softly. Walter's final paragraphs were written more unevenly. Inside the fireproof safe beneath my desk is the last part of the story. Open it only after you understand why this place matters. The evidence belongs to the people. The truth belongs to history. But one thing belongs only to you. Ethan looked beneath the heavy wooden desk. Hidden behind a removable panel sat a compact steel safe anchored directly into the concrete. Mechanical dial, fire-rated, still untouched. Claire looked at him. I didn't see that before. Neither did I. Walter had hidden it in plain sight. The combination wasn't written anywhere. Ethan searched the desk once more. Nothing. Then Koda slowly stood. Ignoring the pain in his shoulder, he limped toward the bookshelf lining the far wall. He stopped beside a framed photograph. Walter stood beside a much younger Ethan wearing army fatigues. Between them, a young Koda. The frame hung slightly crooked. Ethan lifted it from the wall. Behind it, taped neatly to the concrete, rested a single folded card. Only 4 numbers. 1107. November 7th. The day Ethan and Koda had completed their final patrol together before returning home. Walter had known. He had remembered. Ethan turned the safe's dial. The final click echoed softly through the chamber. The heavy door swung open. Inside rested several cassette tapes, a small digital recorder, one thick, sealed envelope, and beneath them, an old military challenge coin from Ethan's engineering unit. He picked it up carefully. His thumb traced the worn insignia. No one outside that unit should have owned one. Walter's last secret had only begun to reveal itself. Ethan turned the heavy challenge coin over in his palm. The brass had been worn smooth around the edges by years of handling. One side carried the insignia of his combat engineer battalion. The other bore a small engraving that every member of his platoon knew by heart. Clear the road. Bring them home. He hadn't seen one since leaving the army. How did Walter get this? Claire asked quietly. I never gave him one. Ethan searched the bottom of the safe. Beneath the coin rested a folded note. It belonged to Sergeant Daniel Mercer. The name struck him like cold steel. Mercer, his platoon sergeant. The man who had pulled Ethan from the smoking wreckage of an MRAP after an IED tore through the convoy outside Kandahar. Mercer hadn't survived the second explosion. Ethan had attended the memorial service. He had watched Mercer's wife receive the folded flag. He read on. Daniel mailed this coin to me 3 months before he died. He had read one of my environmental reports while stationed overseas. He wrote that truth has enemies everywhere, whether buried under a road or buried beneath a mountain. He asked me to keep the coin until I found someone who still believed those words. Ethan lowered the page. For years, he had believed Afghanistan and Montana belonged to different lives. Walter had seen the connection long before he had. Both required someone willing to uncover what others wanted hidden. Claire gently placed a digital recorder on the desk. There are batteries in the drawer. Ethan inserted them. The screen flickered to life. One recording. 43 minutes. He pressed play. Walter's voice filled the chamber. Older than Ethan remembered. Slower. Measured. If you're hearing this, then the evidence survived. And so did you. A long pause followed. I hoped both would happen. Ethan glanced toward Koda, who rested near the doorway with his injured shoulder stretched carefully across the floor. Walter continued. I've spent 11 years documenting what Granite Ridge Mining tried to erase. The company everyone sees isn't the company that exists. The mining permits are real. The trucks are real. The payroll is real. But underneath those operations sits another business entirely. Paper rustled somewhere near Walter's microphone. They purchase forgotten land through shell corporations. They bury industrial waste that should never enter groundwater. They dissolve one company. They create another. They repeat the process. They've done it for years. Claire closed her eyes. Her father had suspected exactly that. Walter's voice grew quieter. I sent reports. I met investigators. I testified. Every agency started asking the right questions, and every investigation somehow disappeared. A chair creaked. Then Walter spoke one sentence more softly than the rest. They weren't burying chemicals. They were burying accountability. The recording continued with names: corporate officers, survey contractors, transportation companies, financial transfers. Every statement matched documents already stacked inside the filing cabinets. Nothing exaggerated. Everything supported. Walter had built a prosecutor's roadmap. When the recording finally ended, neither Ethan nor Claire spoke for nearly a minute. Outside, wind rolled across the mountainside. Deep underground, only the quiet hum of the ventilation system broke the silence. Claire finally stood. We don't send this to one office. Ethan looked up. We send it everywhere. She pulled a legal pad from her briefcase. Federal prosecutors, EPA, state environmental investigators, and 2 investigative journalists I trust, all at once, so nobody can bury it again. Ethan nodded slowly. Redundancy. She smiled faintly. Exactly. The military term fit perfectly. Over the next several days, the underground chamber transformed into a command post. Boxes of evidence covered the work tables. Claire built timelines. Ethan scanned maps, photographs, laboratory reports, and purchase records into encrypted drives. Years of military planning returned naturally. Every document received an index number, every photograph a location, every water sample a chain of custody. Nothing relied on memory. Everything could stand on its own. During breaks, Ethan climbed to the surface to care for Koda. The wound healed slowly. The dog still limped, but refused to stay behind whenever Ethan walked the property. One cold evening, while replacing batteries in a trail camera Walter had hidden years earlier, Ethan noticed fresh tire tracks at the entrance road. Different tread pattern. Large SUV. Recent. He followed them only far enough to confirm they had stopped outside the property boundary. Watching. Nothing more. When he returned below, Koda met him halfway down the stairs. The German shepherd sniffed Ethan's jacket once, then walked immediately to the surveillance monitor Walter had connected to several concealed cameras around the land. One screen blinked. Motion detected. Timestamp. 11 minutes earlier. Ethan enlarged the image. A black SUV sat nearly half a mile away on a neighboring ridge. Windows dark. Engine off. Someone inside held binoculars aimed directly toward Walter's land. Claire stared at the screen. They're not guessing anymore. No. Ethan quietly reached over and turned off the monitor. They're waiting. His phone vibrated. Unknown number. He answered. This is Ethan Brooks. A calm man's voice responded. Mr. Brooks, my name is Victor Hale. I'm the CEO of Granite Ridge Mining. A brief pause. I believe you and I should discuss an arrangement. Victor Hale's voice carried the effortless calm of a man accustomed to ending difficult conversations in his favor. There was no anger, no threat, only confidence. I've heard quite a bit about you, Mr. Brooks, he continued. Combat engineer, Afghanistan, honorable discharge. Hard years after that. Ethan said nothing. Silence had become one of the few things life had taught him to use well. I also understand you've recently inherited property that has caused unnecessary complications. Behind him, Claire quietly reached for a legal pad and began writing, while Ethan placed the phone on speaker. Victor continued. I don't believe either of us benefits from a prolonged legal dispute. This isn't a legal dispute, Ethan replied. It will become one. Another pause. Then the number arrived. I'm prepared to transfer $20 million into any account you choose. Claire stopped writing. Even Koda lifted his head. 20 million, Victor repeated. Tax attorneys, a new home, medical care, a future where no one remembers any of this. Ethan stared at the challenge coin lying on Walter's desk. His thumb rested over the worn words. Bring them home. I've lived out of a pickup truck, Ethan said quietly. I know. I've slept in parking lots. I know. I've lost almost everything. I know. Victor's voice softened. Which is precisely why you deserve a second chance. The words hung in the underground room. A younger version of Ethan might have believed them. The man sitting here no longer did. He looked toward Koda. The German shepherd was asleep now, his bandaged shoulder rising and falling with each slow breath. A scar crossed the bridge of the dog's muzzle. Another hid beneath his coat, where shrapnel had grazed him years ago. Neither scar had ever been a choice. Duty rarely was. I had friends, Ethan said. They were younger than I am now. They cleared roads because families needed to travel them. They didn't come home. Victor remained silent. I've spent years wondering why they survived only in photographs while I kept waking up every morning. His voice never rose. It didn't have to. I finally understand something. Victor waited. The point wasn't that they died. The point was why they stood there in the first place. Claire looked down. She knew better than to interrupt. They believed someone else deserved to live. Ethan continued. So if you think $20 million can buy what they died protecting, he gently picked up Walter's challenge coin. You've called the wrong man. Several seconds passed. When Victor finally spoke again, the warmth had disappeared. You're making a mistake. No. I'm correcting one. The line went dead. The underground room became quiet once more. Claire slowly exhaled. I hope you know what comes next. I do. They'll stop trying to buy us. They'll start trying to outrun us. She nodded. Then we move first. For the next 10 days, they barely slept. Encrypted copies of every report were prepared. Independent laboratories verified Walter's water samples. Claire secured sworn statements from former environmental contractors who had quietly left Granite Ridge years earlier. One by one, pieces of the story stopped depending on Walter alone. They became undeniable. Ethan organized everything with the same discipline he had once used planning route clearance missions. Every folder received duplicate backups. Every digital file existed in 3 separate locations. Every package traveled by a different route. No single failure could destroy the whole operation. Redundancy. Just as Walter had hoped. Meanwhile, news from outside the mountains slowly changed. One investigative reporter called Claire asking for confirmation. Then another. The regional EPA office acknowledged receiving anonymous environmental evidence. A federal prosecutor requested chain of custody documentation. Someone was finally reading. Someone was finally listening. Late one afternoon, Ethan and Koda climbed to the highest ridge overlooking the valley. Snow had begun melting beneath the first warm days of spring. Thin ribbons of water ran downhill through patches of exposed grass. Koda walked more carefully now. His shoulder still bothered him, but he refused to stay behind. Ethan sat on a weathered boulder. Below them, 40 acres stretched quietly beneath the afternoon sun. Nothing about the land suggested what lay underneath. Nothing revealed the years Walter had spent protecting it. Claire's SUV appeared on the access road an hour later. She stepped out holding her phone. They issued the warrants. Ethan stood. Federal? She nodded. And state. The EPA has emergency authority now. She smiled for the first time since arriving on the property days earlier. Granite Ridge's offices are being searched. Multiple executives have resigned. Victor Hale tried to board a private jet outside Boise this morning. Ethan waited. They arrested him before takeoff. The wind carried the news away across the mountains. Neither Ethan nor Claire celebrated. There was too much work left, too much cleanup ahead, too many families who still depended on poisoned groundwater they didn't even know existed. Weeks later, official testing confirmed Walter's findings. Contamination had been spreading underground for years. Public health notices reached towns throughout the region. Emergency water systems were deployed. Cleanup funding began moving through federal agencies. It would take years, perhaps decades, but the damage had finally been named. Truth, Ethan realized, didn't erase the wound. It simply allowed healing to begin. As the sun settled behind the Bitterroot Mountains, Koda rested his head against Ethan's knee. The old soldier scratched gently behind the dog's ears. Neither of them noticed the first green shoots pushing through the blackened earth where the burned shed had once stood. Spring had arrived, and for the first time in many years, so had hope. Hope did not arrive with applause. It came quietly, like snowmelt feeding a creek that had almost run dry. Summer reached the Bitterroot Mountains one careful day at a time. The blackened remains of Walter's shed were cleared away, but Ethan left the old stone chimney standing. It became a marker rather than a ruin, a reminder that some things deserved to be remembered exactly as they were. Federal trucks came first, then environmental engineers, hydrologists, EPA field teams carrying sampling equipment into valleys that had been ignored for years. Everywhere they dug, Walter's records proved accurate. Groundwater contamination followed the same underground paths he had mapped by hand more than a decade earlier. The cleanup would take years. No one pretended otherwise. But for the first time, the people living in the surrounding towns knew the truth. Wells were tested. Temporary filtration systems were installed. Families who had unknowingly relied on polluted water finally had answers instead of rumors. Granite Ridge mining disappeared from the landscape almost as quickly as it had arrived. Its shell companies unraveled one after another. Court filings replaced glossy advertisements. Former executives stood before judges instead of shareholders. Victor Hale's $20 million never came up again. One afternoon, Claire drove up the mountain carrying a thick folder. She found Ethan beside the creek, replacing a split fence rail, while Koda rested nearby in the shade. "The court approved it," she said. Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans. "Approved what?" She smiled. "Walter's land will become protected conservation property." She handed him the documents. "The underground chamber stays exactly where it is. The evidence remains preserved. And there's one more condition." He looked up. "The county approved your proposal." Ethan frowned. "I only mentioned it." "You did more than mention it." Claire pointed toward the open meadow below the ridge. "They want this place to become a recovery retreat for veterans living with PTSD and retired military working dogs." For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. Wind moved through the tall grass. A hawk circled lazily above the valley. He looked at Koda. The old German shepherd had healed well. A thin scar crossed his shoulder where the sheet metal had cut him. But he walked without pain now. Age had slowed him a little. Never his spirit. "I think Walter would have liked that," Ethan finally said. Claire nodded. "I think he planned on it." Construction began before autumn. Not a large facility, just a handful of cabins built from local timber, a workshop, a shared kitchen, walking trails through the forest. One quiet room overlooking the mountains where veterans could simply sit without anyone asking them to explain what they had seen overseas. Ethan built the first cabin himself. The work came naturally. Measure twice, cut once, anchor everything well. Years spent building temporary structures in combat zones had taught him that shelter mattered most when people believed they didn't deserve one. Volunteers began arriving. Some were former soldiers. Some brought retired service dogs whose muzzles had turned gray with age. No one asked many questions. No one needed to. People recognized one another in silence before they recognized one another in conversation. Ethan slept better than he had in years, not every night. There were still mornings when a slamming truck door or the sharp clang of a hammer carried him halfway back to Afghanistan before his mind caught up. On those mornings, Koda would quietly walk over, lean against his leg, and wait. He never rushed the memory away. He simply reminded Ethan where he already was. One October evening, Ethan unlocked the underground chamber again, not because he needed evidence, because he wanted to visit Walter. The room remained exactly as it had been. Orderly, patient, the filing cabinets, the maps, the workbench. He placed a framed photograph on the desk. It showed Walter standing beside a younger Ethan and Koda, all three caught in an unguarded moment of laughter. "I finally understand," Ethan said into the quiet room. "You weren't saving 40 acres. You were saving what they meant." When he climbed back to the surface, the sun was setting behind the Bitterroot Mountains. Golden light stretched across the valley. Near the new cabin, a small garden grew beside the porch. Tomatoes, beans, a row of basil that reminded Ethan of something Walter had once written about tending living things with patience. He filled a watering can from the creek. The water ran clear, cleaner than it had been in years. Koda settled beside the porch steps, watching the valley with the same calm attention he had shown on patrol long ago. Ethan watered the first row of young plants. The earth drank quietly. Nothing about the moment felt dramatic. That was exactly why it mattered. Not long ago, he had owned nothing except an old pickup truck and a faithful dog. Now he had responsibility, purpose, a place where people could come carrying burdens too heavy to explain and leave knowing they were no longer carrying them alone. He looked across the 40 acres everyone had once called worthless. The mountains remained unchanged. The pines still whispered in the wind. The creek still followed the same patient path through the valley. Only one thing had truly changed. A homeless veteran had finally found a home, and an old German shepherd, who had never forgotten his final mission, lay peacefully beside the man he had protected through war, through loss, and all the way to healing. The sun slipped behind the western ridge. The porch light came on. Inside the cabin, warmth waited. Outside, the land no longer held a hidden truth. It simply held a future. If Ethan's journey and Koda's unwavering loyalty meant something to you, leave a simple one in the comments. It may only be one number, but it tells us that courage, loyalty, and doing the right thing still matter. And if you've ever known a veteran, loved a loyal dog, or believe some truths are always worth protecting, we'd love to hear your story too. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because our next story is already waiting, and you won't want to miss the incredible journey that's coming next. Until then, take care of the people who stand beside you, and never underestimate the heart of a faithful dog.